For some time, in the basic position which we discussed after 7th move a6, it was considered a good move for white, 8 e4. So let's have a look at this. Knight f3, bishop g7, g3, short castle, bishop g2, d6, short castle, knight c6, knight c3, a6. Now e4. Well, by default, we have to play bishop g4 because this is very natural move. First of all, sometimes this bishop on c8 doesn't have good square, so since we have the clear plan, the idea is to create a pressure on this diagonal and later to attack the pawn on d4 by playing either e5, knight d4, either knight d7, knight d4, or even knight d7, e5, knight d4, depends. So it's just about pressure on these squares. This bishop g4 is very helpful. He's attacking the important knight on f3. Here white has two main reactions. One is to try to clarify immediately what is going on with h3. We take on f3, of course. Bishop takes f3 and knight d7. So the pawn is hanging. He has to take measure. The most natural way for him is to play bishop e3. Otherwise, we will play knight d4 and c5. So bishop e3 is fine. e5. As we said, we want to put our foot on d4. If d5, then it's a little bit interesting because usually all players would like to take here with the pawn and put the knight on d4. But from practical point of view, exactly here we can take with the knight because this tactical weakness after bishop e2, it's not easy to defend. Knight a5, the only way, because if b3, then we know that this is weakening the c3, so we can take knight c4 after b3. So let's only move to defend it. Queen a4, and here the tactics works. Knight ac4, bishop c4, b5, bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, and subtle move queen c8. Of course, this is correspondence game. What I like about this correspondence database is that it's like not simple computer play, but it's human, like human brain combined with computers. So it's much interesting because some ideas computers still don't understand, but the human understanding and computers' mathematical capacities together gives us very good quality of, very good piece of arts. So in this case, for example, after queen e6, white has troubles with defending against rook b8 and knight c4, and black has full compensation. Instead of d5, after e5 he can play d5, but it's another situation. When we have our knight on d4, we just go there, and typical idea, if possible, to defend this knight by another pawn, we do, of course. c5, tc6, typical move, bc6, queen d3, queen d2, queen a5, f4. So for some time I was considering this this for white, but now I see that simply not in time, but after queen b4, black has enough counterplay here, because I am afraid after b3 some tactics will appear here. So like queen takes c3, for example. So we checked h3 immediately. If after bishop g4 he is defending with the bishop, then very interesting move, rook e8, subtle, very subtle move. This reminds me of Chibanenko's move in the two knights tango, black knights tango, d4, knight f6, c4, knight c6. There we had this move, rook e8, with idea e5 and knight d4. Here is the same idea, just a little bit postponing this e5 and knight d4, waiting for white's reaction. And it happens to be that they don't have any good reaction. For example, if h3, we take on f3, we play e5, d5, knight d4. The idea was always, in both Antibanenko's idea and here, is after queen takes d4, we can take knight e4 because rook protects this pawn on e4. So then they can create this threat to the queen. And if he cannot take the pawn, that's a completely different story. He has to go back. Again, we put this pawn on c5, dc6, bc6. So we have similar situation what we just discussed. And the plans are more or less same. Let's say he goes here, queen d2, queen a5, rook ac1, knight d7. It's a reasonable play for black. Well, after rook e8, he might try also to play here queen c2. In this case, we already take the knight and the e5. So if d5 then knight d4, it's obvious, it should be good. And if after e5 he is playing d5, then again d5, and we have this d5, and we have this control over d4 square, which he cannot control with the pawn. Rook d1, knight d4, and c5. Now the importance of two bishop advantage is minimized. Most probably the game will end to draw in some different color bishop entry. Well, that's about this 8e4. What we have to remember is that the immediate attack on the center with bishop g4, preparing either e5 or knight d7, with the idea of taking control over d4 square and actually placing the knight to d4, it's even better. Most probably white will always take our bishop, bishop f3, bishop h3, bishop f3, bishop f3, bishop e3, e5, d5, knight d4, and play something like this, in which case he cannot take on d4, of course, so we will have time also to play c5 and to make an additional support for our knight on d4.